motion for this year's National Debating Championship 2022, hosted by the UPDS in Manila, Philippines, Quezon City. I'm just waiting for 46 now, right? Across the Straits of the Philippines. The motion for this round is... go ahead, you can go next slide. The real motion is, this House believes that citizens who had their voted candidates lost during an election should be compensated by their government should they decide to transfer citizenship to another foreign government, provided that this state accepts them. All right. Prep time starts now. If you have any questions, you may ask them. But go ahead. Thank you, everyone.
So, hello everyone, welcome to the grand final of this year's National Debate Championship. Congratulations to every single one of you for making it to this stage of the tournament. Per request of the organizing committee, I would like to introduce the teams competing in the National Grand Final. When your team's called, just feel free to introduce yourselves, who's speaking first and second, as well as maybe any pronouns to be noted. So on opening government, we could start. For opening government, we have DLSU, that would be Ken Alunan and Christine Barbosa.
Hello, on OG, speaking first will be Barb.
For opening opposition, we have UPDA. A, consisting of David Africa and Toby Leong.
I'm just gonna wait for the music to start. This is not the song we asked for. There we go. Okay, hi, I'm David. I'll be speaking first member of government. I have no pronoun preferences, and I prefer PYs in chat.
Hello, I'm Toby. I'm speaking over no pronoun preferences, PYs in chat.
All right, great. And finally, for closing opposition, we have ADMU, consisting of Irene De La Cruz and
Wait, we can't start our video. Let us start our video. Go.
Great, we have all the teams introduced. Now, just to introduce the panel, hello, I'm David Mencias. I have the honor of being the chair of this grand final. I will now let my esteemed panelists introduce themselves in the order listed on the tab, starting with Claire and finishing with Ronaldin.
Oh my God, I was muted. Hello, my name is Claire, pronoun she, they. Yeah, congratulations to you guys for coming this far. Good luck.
Hello, I'm Denise, pronouns she, her. Congratulations for making it to the grand finals of NDC and good luck.
Jean.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, I was muted. Hi, everyone. I'm Gene. Best of luck to all the teams.
Hi
Now we
everyone,
have
I'm
Hannah.
Oh, sorry, David. Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. Pronouns she, her. Good luck, everybody.
Hi everyone, I'm JJ, no preferred gender pronouns. Good luck.
Hi guys, I'm JV. He, him. Good luck, debaters.
Hi everyone, I'm Miko, pronouns are he, him. All congrats on making it this far. Good luck to everyone.
Hi everyone, I'm Ronaline, pronouns she, they. Congratulations on making it to grand finals of NDC and good luck.
All right, great. So I guess just a few reminders for now formally begin the debate. Number one, just for the sake of minimizing any errors, please repeat any preferences for PYs as well as your pronouns right before the speech. Secondly, likewise, it is expected that all debaters respect those preferences and respect those pronouns to be as inclusive as possible. And then lastly, finally, PYs are not mandatory, but they are still highly encouraged for the quality of the round. Now to formally open the national grand final. Debating on the motion, this House believes that citizens who had their voted candidates lost during an election should be compensated by the government should they decide to transfer citizenship to another foreign government, provided that the state accepts them. Calling on Prime Minister to formally open this debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, can I be heard? Okay, I'll just assume that people can hear me. Okay, for POIs, please do it in chat because I might get distracted in voice. So I'll take you preferably at 5. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Democracy is for the people and by the people. And what we value about democracy and the beauty of it is that it grants us the choice, the freedom, the property, and the pursuit of happiness. And in this debate, it is more than ever that consent should be valued and we should grant this consent towards citizens. I want to start with a bit of setup before I go on to argue 2 things: why it's principally justified people should be granted democratic consent, and secondly, that the candidates that get into the power don't meet the needs of everyone and leave people behind. Let's go on to the setup. I think the 3 things you have to note here is that 1, we are likely to compensate the cost of moving to another state, so selling resources, reacquiring new resources, plane and travel fares. If other costs need to be included within this compensation, we're more than willing to discuss this based on its merits and the state's capabilities at a later time. Secondly, what do you need to do to be eligible for this program? Twofold. 1, you have to vote in the previous election, and secondly, you need to probably file an application that proves that another state is willing to take you. And the last bit of setup is that the state is likely to have a dedicated treasury for this that it forecasts and keeps for an entire election cycle. However, this House believes that motion, so it does not assume current capacity, but we can decide to only support this when possible. I think a few points on framing as well. 3 points. 1, for this to be a fair debate, the motion presumes that this is a democratic country that upholds elections. Therefore, OP cannot say that these are authoritarian governments that can oppress you. There's likely to be fair and rational democratic states. The second, it's not automatic when you want to transfer citizenship to a foreign government. you will be granted immediately. Notice in the motion that it would allow the state to accept this. So the state would have to probably decide and weigh on these matters with high officials, experts, and think tanks on their side, and all the body of knowledge that they can use to decide whether this is justified or not. Thirdly, this is likely to be the last resort of individuals because the tipping point in the decision is huge. You have to weigh the principles conceded in the laws and the elections against uprooting your current lifestyle, attachments that you've formed to family, friends, and cultures, and you have to restart to your life. So I guess the implications of this is that one, these are probably democratic states and we're going to decide and weigh on this, but secondly, that these are probably a last resort. Let's go on to the principle now. And people should be granted democratic consent. The first thing that we would like to note is that individuals never choose to be born in the state that they reside in. Ultimately, their first citizenship is a random function of the birth lottery. Signs of consent begin to show when individuals begin to influence and impart their belief systems into the entity that governs them through democratic participation and elections. Second, the problem is at this point, consent only extends towards a subtle nudge in the direction of where your states move. But this is not enough to show active consent to the freedoms that you give up. At this point, we argue that there is a monetary barrier to consent because acts of non-consent, as known as actions that allow you to move to a nation that more accurately depicts the form of government you believe in, are hidden behind cost barriers and money. It is expensive to pack up your life, expensive to start anew. A vast majority of the people in the world can't even afford a plane ticket. The last reason is that this lack of consent is material in the round, because let's discuss what you give up in the service to the state you live in. It's laws that dictate your ability to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to pray to gods that give you comfort, to love who you deem worthy of loving, or even restrict your means of survival. It also forces you to lose your life in a lot of instances. It forces you to fight its wars, to lose access to certain medical procedures, to die of starvation for economic policies you know to be wrong. Therefore, we tell you that we prove in this principle that consent is something that democracies have always upheld. This is an extension of that consent that we should grant individuals when their voted candidates are lost. And before that, POI, CO.
So is it the case that a lot of people will be availing this such that your benefits are maximized? Or is it a rigorous process such that only very few people can avail of the service?
I think we will just like allow the people that would want this, and it's going to be an application process and they were going to decide on it. So, okay, moving on. These are candidates that get into power that just don't meet the needs of everyone and leave people behind. I think this is the pragmatic implication, that when we vote for politicians that we feel that the policies would benefit us and be in our favor, we vote for individuals that look like caring about their welfare policies, economic stimulus packages to revive jobs for them, and public infrastructure that we see is in favor of us. That's why we vote for them. But what happens when it is not into our favor? I think these candidates that get into power that end up having policies that are not favorable to us and sometimes even discriminate us. These can be policies that can be anti-poor because you're raising taxes, or politicians that prioritizes the company's qualms rather than public interest, and even welfare packages that aren't strong enough to provide you the job that you need. I think people should be given the option to leave these countries and look for better ways if they can uplift their lives. Because if they don't, the consequences are this. They have to suffer over these policies that they do not consent to. They cannot get the jobs that they want. They have to pay large amounts of taxes that they cannot have the financial capacity to. They cannot have the welfare packages that they need. I think the high monetary barriers to living, especially for the poor, the lower class, why do we need to compensate these individuals? Because I might say, no, that's not mutually exclusive. People can flee if they want to. I think the monetary barrier is so high when you want to leave the country, especially when you're a poor and lower class individual. I think this looks like, one, you need to pay for airfare tickets, which is expensive. Two, you need to get a property. Like housing prices can be so high in different countries that are developed. And thirdly, the high fees that you need to pay for the documentation process itself when you're trying to get the citizenship. And sometimes you would need to even pursue again another educational degree in those institutions. I think these are an issue. These are even issue to the reasonable and most benign democratic states as well, because there's going to be other factors that you cannot control, like corporate capture or the policies that raise taxes and discriminate others, or healthcare systems that don't prioritize the most vulnerable because they are mostly privatized healthcare systems. I think the most reasonable democratic systems have these issues and they cannot uplift everyone. I think the comparative is when you have this policy, we have to give these people the personal momentous decision to choose what kind of life that they want, because one, it will alter their lives drastically, and secondly, it's going to be something that is irreversible to them. I think we give the individuals to go to a country that they feel their needs are met, such as their job, their welfare, and even knowing that they are able to do their taxes. We have to give them the option to pursue the jobs that they idealize, that they feel like is best for them. I think we prove to you in weighing that the most vulnerable of people are able to pursue the life that they want and shield the suffering that they might experience if they stay in those countries. And for all those reasons and more, we exceptionally propose.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, for that wonderful speech. To begin the case of opening opposition, let's call on the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hello, how is the volume? No, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, sorry, you were audible.
Okay, POIs in chat, please, and I will start my speech in a few seconds. We're not against immigration. That's your right as a citizen, but the state should not encourage and financially compensate for it. And we should definitely not let partisan politics, petty partisan politics, override your citizenship and responsibility to the nation. So our stance is quite simple. We will not compensate them. We'd encourage people to view themselves as a citizen, as a Filipino, regardless of who is in power, in our attempt to reduce polarization and encourage consensus building among your citizens, encouraging the narrative that you are a Filipino, regardless of who you voted for. We'd say we can use this money to do other things that are good for society. We can do it to help uplift people's living conditions. We could also give the money to reward people who stay. Policies like the Balik Scientist program, where we pay people to come back to the Philippines and encourage them to contribute to our institutions. We say that their policy is an affront to nationalism and the idea that we are part of an imagined community. And it also makes it harder for us to run a democracy, the point at which people who criticize our government, people who don't like those who are in power, leave and are therefore unable to hold the government to account. A couple of responses. The first thing is they say that you have no choice to be born in that state, and therefore this policy is necessary for you to consent. But this demands a deconstruction. What is a state? We'd say that states always demand sacrifices, and it is not legitimate for them to say that a state demands complete individual freedom from anyone. If we had complete individual freedom, we'd live in an anarchy. And therefore, the fact that we live in a government where we impose rules and laws means it is fair for us to make impositions and say, no, you can't do those things. That's why we have laws, right? And therefore, we say when you have an election, democracy also means consenting to the result. The fact that the state has given you the right to vote, the state has given you the ability to have an informed vote and the safety for you to have that vote in the first place. So the fact that we all honor the winner is a covenant of elections that was agreed upon the moment at which you voted. So we'd say you do consent, the point at which you vote, because that vote was a contract in which you accepted that you would accept the results of the election. But we'd also say if they want to help people who are starving and are facing bad consequences of government policy, you're actually giving money away for people to leave the country, right? And this is very expensive. You have to pay for plane tickets, rent in your new country, navigating that complex government bureaucracy. That money is taken away from helping everyone else, from building better healthcare systems, educational systems to make life better for everyone. So in their attempt to make things better for the individual, they make things worse for the collective as a whole. And this is worse because their policy will likely go against the interests of the vast majority who will not avail of this policy. But secondly, they frame their entire debate on helping the poor, the most vulnerable. But who is likely to be accepted by this policy? It is going to be the rich or the middle class because one, they have more connections in government offices. It is easier for them to navigate bureaucracy, fill up these forms in the first place. Or two, that they have marketable skills so they know they'll be accepted by foreign nations, by the fact that they'll be able to have a living in other countries. The poor likely don't have this. But lastly, I'd say that poor people won't be accepted by the foreign nations because first world countries or even other countries, they do not want a large mass of poor and unskilled individuals entering their country, and therefore they will likely be rejected. So this policy is likely only going to be accepted by the rich, and therefore their benefits do not apply. First argument, nationalism. We say that the state policy should be in line with uniting the country. What is a nation but an imagined community? There is nothing that makes me the same as someone in Visayas or Mindanao that I've never met, except for this idea, this nebulous notion, we are both Filipino. And there are so many factors that are working to divide us, making this necessary. It is like race, gender, or religion that cause people to break away from the concept of the nation and not like each other. In the 21st century, the main factor driving people apart is politics, because of the polarization of media that makes us believe that people who don't vote for our candidate are our enemies. The fact that politics is viewed to be an important part of our identity, and therefore we view people as others simply because of their political orientation. Or the idea that of social media and the culture of anger we've encouraged of hating our opponents. And this means this massively threatens the social fabric of the nation when people begin to view each other not as Filipinos, but as people who are different and as others. This is awful because it leads to a lack of respect for our fellow citizens, more acts of violence and hate crimes against these individuals. The fact we can't resolve disputes peacefully and come to concrete compromises when we don't even believe the other person has our best interest at heart. That's why the state spends so much effort to the national anthem, national language, national birds, to make sure to facilitate this meaning making. That there's so much more to your country than merely politics or race or religion. We have our culture, we have our art that transcends social and ethnic boundaries. How does their policy violate this principle? It actively rewards people for dividing the country and destroying the social fabric, that fomenting the idea that these people should leave and prioritize political orientation over all of the other responsibilities as a citizen. But secondly, it legitimizes the notion that one is the other simply because of the political orientation, right? The narrative makes this normal and correct when the state is literally subsidizing it, right? And there are many impacts to a lack of nationalism in this sense. The idea that you can't create solutions because you don't have their voice, you're not cooperating. Or the idea of unrest, where you can easily justify violence against your opponents who do not view them to be part of the same nation as you. But the second principle here is that you as a government have a responsibility not merely to the people who voted for you, but to all of your citizens. You're the president of the entire nation, because you have powers such as police power, taxation, that must take everyone into consideration as much as possible. This is not perfectly achieved on our side, but states should also not discourage acting in this particular fashion. But their side actively rewards politicians for the divisive rhetoric by not having the problem to be held accountable for that when they actually have to govern. In fact, encouraging not liking your opponents until they leave, forcing them to leave and making it difficult for them to stay, as opposed to actually hearing them out and viewing them as part of their nation. In conclusion, we say the fabric of a nation necessitates that we view people to be part of us, regardless of political orientation of who you voted for. Their side destroys that. PY from CG.
So if you claim that people are required to consent to the results of every election and that people leaving destroys the national identity, why allow people to immigrate at all? It seems like these problems persist.
You know, obviously in every debate, there's a balance between different values. We're not funding it, right? It's a begrudging reality we tentatively accept. We will not encourage it like you do on your side. Secondly, that it is good for oppositions to stay. Sometimes bad people get into power, but it's fine because we have checks and balances from oppositions necessary to correct their errors, to mitigate their abuses by holding rallies, by holding protests, by threatening to vote against them in the next election. But even good political parties aren't perfect, especially if they have no opponent, right? The ANC in South Africa was a party of anti-apartheid. Then they became corrupt because they had no opposition in their party. We'd say a policy that encourages migration based on political orientation benefits the party in power to an extreme degree, right? Because it means that your political opponents are now gone and you have actively created a narrative that they should leave, creating social pressure, telling them that you should not be part of discussions when you have the option to leave. And I'd say if these people leave, that's awful because they will not feel the problems of the people and they have no incentive to care when they are citizens of another country and therefore won't use their connections, their resources to convince people that the government is wrong or that they're harder to hear, they're very far away, there's very few interactions with their fellow citizens. Or we say that their voice is still valuable. We need their input to run the government. We need their criticism to hold governments to account. This is impossible if all your political enemies just leave, and that's why it's better for these people to stay. For all of these reasons, we oppose.
Thank you so much, Leader for Opposition, for that wonderful speech. To extend the case of opening government, let's get Deputy Prime Minister here.
Hi, can I be heard?
You can be heard.
Okay, so I'll be taking POIs between the 5th and the 6th minute. I'll just be asking for one, so don't worry. Okay. Starting my speech in 3. Political theory is often debated and discussed from the comforts of the high walls that make our homes safe. And because of this, it's easy to forget that politics don't exist solely in our minds or even in theory. It manifests in our lives, in the freedom from persecution, in living a life that you believe to be moral and just, or even just the daily experience of hunger, happiness, or just life. All of this is contained within the few lines that we understand to be politics. The first thing that I will do is build off of that intro to discuss a frame that reflects the gravity of the situation being discussed. Because Pep calls it disagreements on petty politics. And I want to take this opportunity to prove something out of pure principle, because this is an unacceptable belief system to have. On this exist two spectrums. On one end, we have reasonably democratic yet still problematic states like the Philippines that subject you to terrible economic policy, driving your family deeper into generational poverty. A nation that forces you to fund a war against your own countrymen in situations wherein long-standing political families use the AFP to kill off activists that threaten their grip on power, or even just force you to ally with countries that you simply do not agree with because of their persecution of people that you agree with, countries like China. But this doesn't only exist in the extreme. Even in the most democratic nations like France and the US and the UK, the stakes of politics are immense, despite the fact that we see them as bastions of democracy. Politics are unpredictable and constantly changing. The democratic bastions of the world transformed into the examples that we use in debates to describe populism and anti-Semitism. The plight of immigrants of these nations drastically changed overnight, and therefore the option to remove your consent should then therefore be available. Second, even seemingly small policies like the regulation of social media, which I think Pep would describe as petty disagreements in politics, snowball into the fundamental beliefs of individuals that govern the way that they live their life, their belief on free speech, or their rights to privacy. So no matter how small the political disagreement, individuals' lives are drastically changed, and the option to escape should then therefore be available. This framing is material in the round. We understand, however, that people are complex. Barb's herself even clarifies that there are many factors that become the tipping point in the decision-making of people. But that's the beauty of defending options, defending consent. Individuals can choose what is important to them. So the outcome for individuals on the ground as a result of this policy is always based off of impacts that are most central to them. Opening opposition fights for things like, for example, a more collected state, a more nationalistic state. We don't know if individuals value that. The thing is, we defend consent. We allow individuals to choose which state they relate with the most. And if they value nationalism, they can access that on our side as well. They don't have to opt into this policy. If this isn't something that they disagree with, opening opposition has no recourse for these types of individuals. But let's deal with the obvious elephant in the room in the discussion of economic feasibility. And I know that probably CEO will run this. On principle, I just want you to use your gut to vibe check this argument. If their qualm with this policy is that we deprive people of their democratic rights for economic incentives, or because we simply cannot afford it, then number one, we subject people to lives that they don't want to live for our own economic gain, which on grounds is akin towards slavery and deplorable no matter what way you put it. Secondly, individuals are simply deserving of this economic compensation. These individuals paid taxes, contributed to the economies of these nations. If you take a portion of their taxes to pay for this, then we're simply okay with it. On principle, this is something that you should allow despite economic qualms. But second, let's talk about why we can't afford it. The discussion on money. Look, the state runs policies it can't afford over time. This house believes that motion. So we move towards that point where we can afford it in the future. That's why we pass laws to fund museums and cultural programs that we can't afford. This is quite simply something that we can work on. It doesn't have to be right now. Second, people themselves need to be cared for by the state, and therefore the money is likely to be symmetric. If we have to pay for things like, for example, plane fare, the cost of restarting your life, that is compensated and just made parallel by the fact that we no longer have to pay for their welfare, their housing. That means to say that the cost that we put out is cost that we'd save in the future, and as a result of that, the cost isn't material in today's debate. Thirdly, there's an immense tipping point in making this decision. People don't just want to uproot their lives for something that is petty. This is likely something that isn't going to happen en masse right away. If it does happen en masse, then there are grave disagreements, and we think that that is then therefore justified. The next thing that they say, and this is directly responding to OO, is that state-imposed limitations are the norm, but they don't justify this. Just because something is the norm doesn't necessarily mean that something is morally justified. For so long, it was the norm for the oppression and persecution of minority groups like women or people of color. And as a result of that, because we never questioned those norms, those limitations were never questioned, and those limitations stayed for a long period of time. In fact, it's not true that this is the norm. The premise of a social contract is that it is a contract. Both parties must agree. But OP does not realize that there's no ability for consent towards that contract. How do people know that how do we know on opposition that people agree to unfavorable results in elections? And insofar as people have no choice but to stay, I think that means that there's no option to consent towards the outcome of that elections if you don't have the more monetary capital to leave. Before I move on, any POIs from CO?
Should citizens be exempted from a law that they do not agree with?
No, that's why we should allow them to leave. Okay, but let's deal with a very constructive response towards CG. They say that this is about nationalism and a lack of respect and cultivating hatred within nations. I'm going to flip this argument on its head. We say, if you believe, if there are people that you hate, if there is hatred within your nation and a huge disdain for the concept of nationalism, okay, go leave. Because if the problem is that people have such fundamental disagreements that there is no way that they could go about living their lives without hatred towards their neighbors, then we're okay with them leaving. That's the whole point of the policy. In fact, we would suggest that the policy fixes the gap that it causes, because this isn't just a debate about people leaving. It's also a debate about people coming in. Insofar as this is a motion that should be debated generally, we do not simply assume that this is about a nation allowing all of its citizens to leave, but a global policy that allows individuals to come in. Even if that wasn't the case, I think that immigration towards nations that you agree with is currently the norm, and we're just allowing that norm to continue to exist by filling in the financial barriers. So nations then therefore are no longer divided by race, history, or ethnicity, and become closer to the goal of everybody holding hands singing Kumbaya, because nations become divided by political beliefs instead. As the mass influx and exodus of people that share or disagree with certain beliefs happens, nations then tend towards individuals just living in states that they generally agree with, living lives being governed by principles that they enjoy. In fact, this is the norm. Globalization and the birth of the global citizen was driven by the growing middle class that could afford to immigrate, being exposed towards cultures that they enjoyed, and therefore moving to these nations because this is the form of government that they enjoy. This is a benefit that has been for so long hidden behind the monetary barriers that only the middle class can afford. I think that it's time that we extend these benefits. It's a right that they should have. It's a right that they've been denied for way too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that wonderful speech. And the opening half of this debate, let's call the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
No, second. Starting my speech. So let's try to translate the principle that OG is arguing into a bit more understandable language. If Pep and I thought we were losing our exchange, which we're not, by the way, we could decide to leave the Zoom call before my speech because we do not, even though we are consented to the process of democracy beforehand, because we did not get the result we wanted, we are retracting that consent in spite of the trust that other citizens place in us consenting to these kinds of processes. We think the premise behind elections and even behind democracies is we're willing to respect the results and the opinions of fellow citizens precisely because it is how states are even capable of being run in the first place. Kenny says that there's disagreement and that must mean you must let them leave. One, I think that this does not reflect in how any kind of other state policy is run. We do not allow people to refuse to pay taxes because they disagree with a law. We do not allow them to join armed groups because they do not like the government. We do not think we should let them emigrate either. But secondly, I would think that we can also construct principles pragmatically. That if we show that this makes the government completely non-functional, it also makes it very difficult to argue that principle. So let's look at a typical contested election. Someone like Fidel Ramos winning the presidential vote with 20% of the vote because of the first past vote system. At best, you're allowing like 80% of your country to potentially leave the country. It is incredibly risky, especially if that election was contested, especially if, as Pep argued, people are quite polarized, at the point where people are constantly leaving and entering every 2 years and there are no stable jobs, there is no stable employment. It's very difficult to even run a country in the first place, especially when the state is encouraging people to think like this. So even if it's not like literally everyone who leaves, so long as a substantial number of people leave, and given the anger that Pep characterizes with, it is likely to be a substantial people, at the point where a country becomes ungovernable, that kind of principle does not stand either. The last thing I want to talk about then is this is also funds that come from taxation, which means that you are equally bound by your duty to the taxpayers to protect their interests. This is a principal-agent relationship. The people who are the principals are merely giving that money to the government so that they can protect their interests. The problem is that we showed you this is directly against the public interest because we are funding people to leave the country, to not contribute to national development, to not seek opportunities and improve services here, but rather to do it in other countries in ways that by definition, because they're no longer citizens, are not going to help you anymore. So I would say, insofar as you're protecting the rights of minorities, we are protecting the rights of all taxpayers to have that principal-agent relationship respected. Lastly, they also say that, but choice matters. But again, enforcing this policy substantially reduces the choices of others. The first thing I want to note is Pep's argument about democracy itself being in danger because this leads and tends towards conglomeration and one-party rule goes unresponded to. The response we get from Kenny is that, well, other countries are doing it too, and it's okay then because we have options. But I would say, if you believe this characterization, that's terrible from an IR perspective. One, that means not just one country is becoming inefficient because there's no political competition, but even the other countries are also becoming inefficient. You're likely to not be able to get any good service delivery or non-corrupt politics anywhere precisely because it's an international policy. But two, even from an IR angle, you're likely to have more wars and sanctions, aggressive behavior as well. Because rather than having to cater to a diverse group of people with differing political beliefs who might not like invasions or might not like going to wars with other countries, it's precisely the people who want to go to those wars, who want to engage in aggression, who probably hate the other country because they stole all your citizens, who are likely going to encourage more and more foreign policy actions that are incredibly bad. So I would say at the point we don't have a democracy, we likely don't even have a functioning country precisely because of all this increased aggression. You're likely not to uphold that principle of choice at the point where people don't have access to those choices in the first place. The next thing I want to talk about is the idea of increasing inequality. Because Kenny said that we're actually making things easier for people because we're funding their plane tickets and their whatever. The first thing I want to point out is that the policy only happened at the point of acceptance, which means that even if you fund the plane tickets of people or give them a stipend, if they're not going to be accepted in the first place, that argument does not stand. Remember, this policy is retroactive only after they've been accepted, which means, one, poor people who do not have not have connections abroad, who do not have marketable skills, are likely going to be unable to affect this policy, which means that their greatest benefit towards these people who are likely to be conscripted into wars probably does not happen. But secondly, I would say that you actively worsen the inequality in the country because you're like getting these skilled laborers, we're moving them out of the country, we're making sure that you cannot benefit from them in the future. And even if new people get in, that is like a whole new foreign population that is going to be accepted. It's very difficult to integrate first-generation immigrants in that way, especially if they're only choosing your country because they agreed politically and not because they had something in common with it, or not, didn't like actually research this country. They're just doing that out of political anger. It's incredibly difficult to do, pragmatically speaking, and likely this country isn't going to work either. If there's a PY from CT, I'll take one now. Otherwise, I will do something else.
So to clarify, in what instances would people be so angry with the state that they will all leave to the degree of crippling the state's infrastructure?
At the point directly after elections, when people are incredibly angry, when people are not thinking correctly, and they're unable to make these decisions in balanced and rational ways. That exactly is my next extension. This encourages very, very hasty decision-making. When will people avail of this policy? And note that this is a pragmatic response, but also a principled one, because Gov's entire principle is contingent on improving the lives of people who leave. If we prove that this is going to be an irresponsible choice, that principle is no longer met. One, it's likely to be times of incredible anger. It's likely to be right after a politician has, maybe out of turn said something, something that ticked you off, and therefore you're incredibly pissed off. Two, it's probably going to be an incredibly short notice that you only find out the results of an election on the day of the election itself. So clearly it's not exactly something you can plan for. But three, it's likely to be at a point where the perception you have of the incoming government is by construction incredibly biased and not an accurate representation of how they're actually going to govern. What does this mean then? This means that these decisions are likely not to be very well thought out and made on incredibly short-term notice. Two, you're likely not going to be selecting the emigrating country well. It's just going to be whoever is available and willing to accept you rather than the actual best choice. But thirdly, as a lot of corollary of Pep's argument, people who are not capable of making this choice, who even if they receive a stipend are not going to successfully integrate into these countries, but were pushed in the spur of a moment because the state was telling you it was okay to do this, are actively going to be making this choice. This means even if you judge the debate purely on the metric of do we make the lives of the citizens better and respect their choices, yes, they might agree politically, but all these other harms that apply to them because they weren't able to think through it, because they might regret it, because the description of what the government was going to be like was not accurate precisely because they made this decision when they were angry, is not going to be met and actively hurts the same people they're trying to protect.
Thank you for that speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To open the closing half of this debate, let's call on Member of Government. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Hello, you can be heard.
All right, tell me if the mic's too loud or too soft or just right, I guess. I'll take POIs in chat. That's about it. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The state holds a monopoly over the country you live in, and using that monopoly can threaten you with violence, arbitrary imprisonment, and taxation. In all other instances, the state has a moral obligation to break such monopolies. Such is no different with this motion. So when OO says, we don't allow people to dodge taxes because they don't like the law, closing government asks, maybe we should. 3 pushes in this speech. 1. That it is an existing right to leave as a form of self-defense and political representation. 2. That it creates an incentive to make states better and reduce polarization. And 3. It makes the state better for those left behind. Before that, I have 3 responses to opening opposition. First, they say this policy will mainly be used by the rich because foreign countries don't want poor people. First response, rich people with marketable skills can already leave. It isn't really used by the rich. Secondly, foreign countries really want poor people the most since they're the most willing to work and form a good long-term labor base for the country. So this objection is false. Secondly, they say the nation should be united and it creates a narrative that people are divided. Aside from the fact that this is really analytically not proven, they don't explain how it creates a narrative or how people receive the narrative, there's just a timeline problem. This policy is only taken when people already feel divided. So in reality, people are already discontent and the difference is that OO has no solution to this discontent. Our fix is to allow people to move to a country where they do feel like they belong. The last thing they say is this benefits the political party in power when you make your opponents leave. And to this we have 2 very easy responses. 1, if all the people unhappy with the government are gone, this sounds like a win-win. Now the entire country is united, which is opening opposition's goal, and everyone who's unhappy with the country gets to move to a country they're happy with. 2, if your problem is that it's super expensive, then the incentive of the government is the exact other way around. They don't want to make their opponents leave because that costs a lot of money, which will be my second argument. But to illustrate in response, if this is true, that this is so bad of a harm, then it negates totally their entire argument that this will benefit the party in power, since it simply doesn't, and it creates an incentive for them to represent as many people as possible. Argument number 1. We think that the state has an obligation not just to grant your rights in theory, but to make your rights accessible. We don't agree with opening government that this is about whether or not you have the right to leave the country, since otherwise you would just travel ban, right? All arguments about why things aren't that bad, or it's okay even if you lose, are irrelevant unless they're willing to stop people from leaving entirely. What matters then is determining whether or not this right is currently equally accessible in the same way that all fundamental rights are. Education, healthcare, speech, etc. We sue the state when it fails to provide these things, and it has to, even if it's super expensive. Your ability to opt out of the social contract when the state is no longer upholding its part of the bargain and has voided your right to representation is an equally valuable right for the basic reason that it's not about consent, but that when the state enacts policies that you do not explicitly agree with, this is an act of instantiated violence against you because it threatens to commit violence against you if you do not comply. The problem in status quo is that the right is not equally accessible. Only the wealthy elite who can afford to change their citizenship because of the exorbitant than costs involved, while the average man cannot, which is crucial because the wealthy elite gain a form of representation out of the vote. Capital flight, which pressures the state to act in ways that they want, while the people who are poor have no credible ability to leave, cannot use this as a form of representation. It doesn't matter if elections work too, because OP has to prove that this extra form of representation is conscionable when it is clearly and evidently not. So why is this argument debate winning? First, it shows an outcome-independent principle for why we should win, by showing that it is an integral right that states should provide you. Even if it is hard, expensive, or has some unforeseen doubt, it is obligatory, not just because of some consent that opening government brings up, but because to not do so would be violent. But secondly and lastly is that it shows a principle more powerful than OG's consent. That is, the prerequisite for that consent is to live in a society that provides access to an alternative, which is why our principle is prior to opening governments. This ends the debate and already gives us a free win over top half. But secondly, I also want to argue that this creates a more safe and more accountable state, the pragmatic that OG never really runs. CEO asks in a POI, will this compensation be used a lot or very rarely? We think this is a really important question, and the answer is it will be used a lot when states are very bad and used very little when states are very good. If this is really expensive, the state naturally has incentives not to let that happen, which means politicians campaign to the interests of all people, not just a few, since they don't want their infrastructure to be crippled when they come into power. This solves a very important problem in modern day politics and the problem of opposition bench. When the candidate wins by 51%, they now only cater to the 51% that voted for them and ignore their obligation to the remaining 49%. In this new world where we envision, we place an active cost to ignoring the remaining 49%, because to do so would be to cost your administration a substantial amount of budget if opposition bench is to be believed. So we place an imposition on states to cater to more than just a slim majority they have won over, which means you're less likely to see backsliding into authoritarianism. It means that Trump couldn't have reversed Obamacare since it would have been too risky and too many people relied on it, and it means in elections you don't have an incentive to insult your political opponents, which means we have the best fixed polarization, not opening opposition, not closing opposition. It is our side provides the strongest credible incentive to unite the country, but in addition to represent everyone when you get into power. This argument is debate winning for 4 reasons. So I'm going to meta build. I'm going to provide structural reasons for why the second argument wins this debate. 1, it gives the largest benefit in terms of size and gravity. We say states never pass such oppressive policy in the first place. OG's only problem is, we would like people to leave. States never do this in the first place, so it is automatically prior and larger in scale. Additionally, this argument provides a benefit that affects a guaranteed half the population nearly every term and affects a particularly vulnerable group of that population that is politically underrepresented. It activates more often than any other team's argument, that is constantly and before people take any action at all, and engages to the best case of opposition bench. This argument does it all. I'll take a POI from OO now.
The problem with this mechanism is that at the point where they know that people will leave eventually, they will no longer face political opposition if things do go wrong, which is why they still have incentive to be very divisive.
It's expensive. You're the one saying it will cripple the state. You don't want to run a state that's crippled, so you won't do this. You give yourself the mechanism. You can't contradict that mechanism. It's either really bad for the people in charge or really good, but in both cases, opposition bench is losing. Lastly, this is also really good for the people that get left behind for 3 reasons. 1, there are less people competing for limited social resources. Hospitals have more beds and ventilators to distribute, roads are less congested, and people are happier when they're left behind. So not the state, the people on the ground are happier. Secondly, the second benefit is that there are less people competing for limited economic resources, less people fighting for the same job, less people competing to rent the same apartments, and so on. But thirdly is that if there are people that are deeply discontent with the policy so as to leave the country, these are the same people that are likely to break the laws you voted into power. These are the people most likely to go to back alley abortions, join the militias that opening opposition talks about. So if their problem is, we don't want people to not obey taxes, guess what? A state full of these people will make everyone else who agrees with these laws substantially more unhappy and unable to avail of these policies, which means the people that get left behind also live better lives. Which means not only do we credibly account for every actor in this debate, we work on the best case of every possible opposition bench case line and prove why we're winning each and every one of them. So for these reasons, from member of government, closing government is winning this debate.
Thank you for that speech, member of government. Go ahead and introduce the case of closing opposition. Let's have member of opposition. Here.
Hi. Can I be seen and heard?
You can be seen and heard.
Great. I prefer my POIs in the chat. There you go. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right off the bat, government bench can't win this debate because they do not analyze the possibility of other alternatives. Simply, it doesn't seem like migrating to a whole new country is your only alternative in a political climate where your candidate didn't win. If it is true, and I think the entire debate would generally agree, that this works in a generally functioning democracy, there's usually space to dissent that is not only good for you and to appease your own personal political opinions, but actually creates tangible change for you and allows you to shape your own reality. I have two things in this speech. First, why the state should not sponsor immigration on the basis of political disagreement at a principled level, and why we think it's just far more understandable coming from opposing opposition. But second, how this changes political landscapes that are worse for minorities, engaging directly with the case that comes from the previous speaker. Before I move on to that, I have two responses to say. First, I just want to point out the lack of alternatives, or the lack of alternatives that they think don't exist. I think the urgency of government can only be believed if you agree that there aren't existing platforms that appease political representation in the instances that your candidate doesn't win. Again, this is a generally functioning democracy, so they probably allow you to dissent in some way and allow you to campaign for other things that you might like. There are a multitude of other capacities for you to gain increased representation, for example, just because your presidential candidate didn't win. Other, for example, elections when the other half of senators are elected later in 3 years, or for the fact that you can lobby in political action groups to be able to get your voice heard. Maybe you don't necessarily get the candidate that you want, but there's an increasing likelihood that the candidate co-opts a lot of the platforms you actually like for the fact that you have the ability to do so. Not to mention elections in local governments that you might have more stake in and more ability to influence over. Maybe, for example, your barangay tanod. Maybe, for example, your senator, your congressman, etc., etc. It is unclear to me why at this point in time, these alternatives don't necessarily work when a lot of the times you have the ability to influence local elections to a much greater degree, and political action groups can create tangible change, the point at which they have the numbers needed to be able to force a lot of these administration politicians to co-opt the benefits they wanted. But the second point of response I want to talk about is that leave it aside, in the worst case scenario where everyone leaves, then the entire country is united. That's actually quite a good thing because everyone has the same political ideology. Listen very carefully because this is actually good. If you measure the success of your government using the standards of your government, of course you're always going to be happy. This doesn't mean it's good, because if your state is possibly violent and you might be okay with it because that is your political ideology and everyone seems to be agrees with it, that's not always good. What is important is that you need to be contested to make meaningful decisions. What happens on side government, even in supposedly the worst case scenario that they deal with, a brainwashed populace, which we don't support. First argument, why the state should not sponsor immigration on the basis of political disagreement. I think so far you hear airy-fairy, ungrounded principles. We ask the simple question: when does the state have to sponsor anything? We think there are two standards. First, it's either a moral failing on the part of the state, which is why they need to compensate you in some way, or second, it is a unanimous good that is good for everyone else in the state. Simply, we would suggest sponsoring immigration doesn't fulfill either of these things. First level of the principle is that the state only has an obligation to sponsor anything if it stems from a moral failing on the part of the state. So, for example, the state provides welfare because they previously failed to deliver equitable development across the nation. The state sponsors affirmative action because it is the failure of the state to protect your protected attributes. I would suggest that your candidate losing is not a moral failing of the state as long as the election is free and fair, simply because it's just a mere consequence of the election process in general. And I want to point out, if closing government, or any government bench for that matter, tells us that the candidate losing an election is a moral failing of the state, then by extension, they are against any type of election with multiple candidates and that give choices to the people, because naturally someone will lose. If you believe that your candidate failing is a moral, and your candidate not winning is a moral failing of the state, then at that point in time, you don't really in that point in time, it's not actually your thing. They are against elections in general. The parallels of government don't work, because when they talk about the reasons as to why people leave, maybe you are vehemently against them, maybe they're actually abusing you. This is a failing state. The state is failing. It's separate from the election process in itself, but rather they just discuss a bad candidate that possibly wins. Notice, you cannot rely on a bad candidate or possibly super against all of these things, because what we are talking about in the debate is what is inherent to the election process. But the second level of this principle is that the second other possible reason that the state sponsors something is that if it is a unanimous good for the collective state. For example, sponsoring research projects, sponsoring college educations. We would suggest that migration for the reason of political disagreements is actually really bad for the collective state. I want to point out, the state doesn't just have an obligation to you, they have an obligation to everyone else. The you leaving, or a significant amount of people leaving, is a loss of an economic workforce. If it's true that the elites are the the ones that are leaving, it results in binging. Or for example, for the fact that the political opposition is lost, lacking criticism, which is just generally worse for everyone else that remains. Under these two levels, which we already see in status quo and is the most grounded in reality, it is very clear that sponsoring immigration is not within the obligation of the state to sponsor. This argument is important, it's independent of outcome, and the clearest principle you hear from the round. I'd like to take one from OG.
This principle doesn't fly because it assumes that the way that things are the way that they should always be. When people died of starvation in the past, that was the way that things were. In the same way, just because we don't consider it to be a failure right now, doesn't mean that the inability to cater to every single citizen isn't a similar failure.
Okay, I want to point out, if opening government is suggesting we can't make parallels to any existing principle, how the hell are you supposed to debate principles? I would suggest using a lot of these status quo and the values of society today is what's important in ensuring that we parallel the victors of the debate, for example, to what people actually value at this point in time. We would suggest that we are grounded in reality and what people actually want. I don't think the POI does what you think it does, sir. Second argument, how this changes the political landscapes and makes it worse for minorities. The premise here is that government introduces a factor that threatens politicians and the support spaces, and specifically it threatens to remove any moves against the majority that stray too far. What it does is that small politicians are scared of being attacked by a majority and will not champion radical change because it becomes the reason for their support bases to leave the country and lose hope. This is the entire basis of the argument that comes from closing government, is to say that they mediate a lot of these things better, is to say that they become a less polarized election force. This is not necessarily good because minorities cannot just settle with centrism. They cannot just settle, for example, with a peacetime happy political system, because in many instances, it is the radical change that is required for them to get any meaningful improvement in their life. I want to point out, if these people and the minorities and the fringes feel as though they are not heard, is when they resort to things outside the elections that are possibly worse, like violence, like cheating, etc., etc. So all of the harms of having an underrepresented minority is far worse on side government, because as closing government says themselves, they want to be less polarized and more appeal to the majority, which in most instances is not good for the people who are the most vulnerable. I want to make very clear the benefit that I have with this argument. We don't need the minority to win to get the benefit, because for the fact that it is on the platform, for the fact that it's in discussions in elections, it's good because it is at that point where other politicians can co-opt these things, or a lot of these stances can gain traction a lot later. You cannot gain traction later if your support bases leave. This is particularly important to the election process and why we win the debate. Thanks.
Thanks for that speech, member of opposition. To conclude the case for closing government on the government bench, let's have government whip. Here.
Hello. I was cutting out a while ago, so just tell me if my internet's dying, and then I will start my speech from whenever I cut off. I will take POIs in chat. I hope nothing happens. Salamat. Start in 3, 2, 1. The line between democracy and tyranny is drawn at the power afforded to the everyday man. The case we bring you from CG is vital, and it's quite a shame that CO decides to brush it off. Beyond the ballot, we say everyone is entitled to the ability to opt out of the social contract by leaving the state. And that is a fundamental right that even their opening concedes to when they say you have the right to immigrate. We explain that whenever a fundamental right is obstructed, the burden falls on the state to provide it for you. In the same way we require states to build schools, hospitals, and roads for those who do not have them. This isn't a debate about whether the right exists, so you can chuck out top half material and CO's material on the right not existing because you have alternatives. Because the right does exist. It exists currently for a select few people in the population who have the money and resources to immigrate out. The real burden on opposition is to explain why it's just that this form of representation should remain exclusive to the elite, and why the state has no obligation to make this accessible as it should be. Clearly, they have failed to meet that, which is why they lose already. I will do 3 things in this speech. First, I will respond to CO's case about alternatives and explain why that doesn't affect the principled case we bring you at all. Then I will ask, secondly, when are states obligated to compensate their citizens and why it's in this instance that matters. And finally, what incentives this creates for the state and why we actually get better, pragmatic outcomes regardless of whether or not we believe people will leave. Let's begin with taking out CO. They say is, well, you cannot give this to people and cannot compensate them if they have plenty of alternatives. 3 responses. 1, think about the context where this motion operates. By definition, you voted in the election. If you believe the context that it's extremely hard to immigrate, even beyond the financial costs, because you have to give up your family and social ties, then it's likely that you voted in many, many different elections, but still feel like you are prosecuted by the state. So clearly the threshold of alternatives is met. Second, they have to prove that their alternatives work, which is the same for OO, by the way. That's to say the premise of their case, that you consent to the laws of the state, only works if they can prove that you consented to the laws of the state. Elections are broken for a whole set of reasons. Many people aren't able to vote. Many candidates don't represent the true interest of the population. In an environment where we cannot assure that democracy is functional, our burden is to provide as many alternatives as possible, which is why it's good that we expand the ability to immigrate to a large population. But thirdly, I point out that even if there are alternatives, that's not how rights work. Even if there are alternatives to climbing the social ladder, that doesn't mean the state no longer has an obligation to provide public schooling. For instance, just because there's some other way to do it, doesn't mean you can reasonably deprive it from people, which is why that case dies. 2, when are states obligated to compensate their citizens? And I want to flag first that costs, unity, and nationalism are secondary to your access to fundamental rights. We sue the state when it fails to build schools in far-flung regions, even if it's too expensive to be feasible, or when those students might grow up to be dissidents who will disrupt national unity. It's OP's burden to show why that doesn't apply. They simply fail to. What do we hear in response? The first thing we hear is CO's case, which is that there are 2 standards you need to meet compensation: moral failing and uniform good. First, I point out that this is a literal assertion. There's no explanation for why these are the standards that need to be met in this instance. Clearly they aren't, because your own opening is willing to grant these rights to other people already, as long as those people have the capital. But secondly, let's be incredibly charitable and assume that these are the standards for meeting these principles. Both of them are met in the instance when people can't immigrate. It's a moral failing that there is such massive inequality and such massive political polarization in that state that people feel persecuted enough, and if you believe the context from them that lots of people will leave, massive amounts of people feel persecuted enough that they feel like they have no other option but to leave that state and have to use their resources to do so. But second, we point out from David that in many instances, this does create unanimous good because it creates incentives away from political polarization, which, by the way, gets no direct response from Irene, which means that benefit stands. So even on the vague and asserted standards of CO, this principle is something you must respect. Why does this win us the debate? 2 things. 1, it reframes the debate. It's not a debate about the existence of the right to immigrate, which is why top half is out. It's about where the line is drawn and drawing it more closely to where it should be drawn. Where currently only the wealthy can access this, we say the state has to provide a public alternative. Secondly, this points out an additional burden the op bench has failed to clear and cannot clear at MICA at op whip. They have to prove why the elite should be granted this additional form of representation aside from the ballot, why they should be allowed to manipulate state policy by threatening to leave and bringing their capital with them while no one else can do so. No one else can incur a similar cost on the state. We are leveling the playing field. It's their burden to show us why it shouldn't be the case. I'll take up UI from closing if they have anything, if not opening. Opening?
But this is also a debate about public funds. The state has a principal-agent relationship with the people who chose to stay, which means that even if the right exists to immigrate, the interests of the people who chose to stay take precedent.
No, we explain firstly why this is in line with the people who chose to stay, but secondly, we explain why you in many instances are part of the people who contributed to those public funds. Like, just because more people are in Metro Manila or in big regions doesn't mean we should stop building schools in far-flung regions because there are less people there. It's not about proportionality, it's about access to the right. Finally then, what incentives does this create for the state? So O is echoed by CO here in their claim that this is an affront to national unity and that winning parties will push you to leave. There are 2 problems with this. 1, vibe check. If enough people are so disgusted with the ruling party that they would leave, then the state is already divided even before you had an election and even before people chose to leave. In fact, fact, if you follow the logic from Irene that many of these people feel so oppressed that they have no alternative except violence, we would vastly prefer allowing these people to leave than the state devolving into ethnic conflict or occupation. That is just far worse than a concession they make there. But second, I'd flip this. Ruling parties already use every means they have to oppress people and make themselves unaccountable, except in status quo, they do that through the democratic system. They gerrymander, they politically suppress you, they restrict your access to the ballot, as Republicans do in every state by making it harder for minorities to vote. So the real comparative for these minorities isn't between leaving and staying in a perfect state. It's in their world staying in a perfect state and no longer having any ability to vote or represent yourself, which is why we ought to provide them an alternative. But what do you get in the comparison? And I just have to flag, unity is not a platform you can run on and is not an argument you can win the debate with, but there are three additional things to go unresponded to from David. One, the fact that this minimizes the incentive to prosecute political dissidents, making the state even more accountable and improving the process that way. Two, the fact that this creates incentives to reduce polarization, winning on OO's metric and leading to better policy, winning on the metric of providing like some sort of uniform good on CO. I would point out that this applies in any context, regardless of whether or not people choose to leave or not, because they always have the ability to threaten to leave and represent themselves in that way. But three, we analyze the extreme ends of the case where a good proportion of the population does leave and explain why that's the best outcome. For all of these reasons, CJ.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. To formally end this debate, let's have opposition whip. Here.
Hello, am I clear and audible?
Hello, you are clear and audible.
All right, I am just fixing my screen. While I do that, UI preference in the chat. I will put that there, chat. All right, I will not take up UI through voice. So just, and I'm sure I'll take up UI, so just put it there. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reasons government bench provides to prove that there is a state moral failing is massive inequality, abusive politicians, polarizing candidates. These are all not inherent to the election process. Your candidate losing is not the state's moral failure. Toby does not engage in the meaningful principle that comes from Irene, which still stands at the end of his speech. We are not encouraging the elites to leave and granting them that right. That's why it's a massive personal cost for them to leave in the first place, and therefore the burden Toby pushes doesn't have to be answered because we're not granting the elites the right. In fact, they sacrifice a lot of their rights by leaving because it's a massive personal cost, because we are not sponsoring them leaving in the first place. What I'm going to do in my speech then is destroy the fundamental assumptions that GovBench relies on and just simply explain why Irene's extension is debate winning. First, I ask a simple question. Will it be a lot of people availing such that a lot of people are benefited, or is it a rigorous process that only a few can avail of the service? If a lot of people leave, this is a lot of money. And it's not that this money comes from the healthcare, etc., from OO, which is a very generic understanding of the national budget. Usually, when majority wins, they dedicate a budget that tries to enact co-optable policies from the minority because they have incentive to reduce conflict. This is where they will get money from in order to fund the treasury fund from opening government and closing government. This is a debate-winning analysis because it's not just you take away from government departments, but because this money is taken away from policies that potentially mends the divides. So you create a circular problem of violence, you create a circular problem of divide, that the policy of Gov therefore creates their own problems at the end. This takes down CG and O as well, because we prove on CO how we can actually mend divides, and their problem may be good good in the short term, but they never proved why it was sustainable. If only a few people leave, which is another frame that David engages in, these are the most privileged people who leave because they pass the rigorous high barrier process. So it's really not intuitive for you to believe that it's the poor who gets access to very limited slots, right? It is unjust, therefore, to spend money of them at the expense of people who cannot leave. They are also the people who benefited, and I dare say they created the unfair structures within the state because David said if they stay, they have the capacity to skirt the law. This concession is damning to their principle that rests on helping the most vulnerable. What are the fundamental assumptions, therefore, that CG rests their case on? The first is making the right equally accessible. I want you to listen to this very carefully. This principle only stands when you give back to the state. That's why we're okay with migration, because they give back through remittances. The effect of that compensation of government's policy outlasts your stay in that state. And that's why the state doesn't have the obligation to protect you after you cut ties with them. This is why the parallelism on migration that they think wins them the debate actually is the reason why they lose. The second thing that they peg their case on is less polarization. Toby says we ignore this extension, but the argument from Irene, which is that politicians will create centrist policies, is a direct comparison, and the best case from David, by the way, which he failed to respond to. This is, and therefore, if they create more centrist policies over time, which Irene compares to be oppressive to minorities, and is the tipping point to get the worst forms of divisive mechanisms, which also flips the harms of law breaking that David argues. Third, they say it's better for the people who stay because the population is less. This is a very simplistic understanding of the economy because the people who leave are also the most capacitated. So the prerequisites of creating better structures of society fail on Gov. And this is why the alternatives that Irene brought up are important because our alternatives do not exist at the expense of your future agency, but the alternative that you do give a right to on government bench causes all of these harms. Lastly, they say the poor will be the ones to make use of this compensation because the rich already has money. But OG's policy is that it's based on a meritocratic process. Even if the rich will be included, they are probably the first on the list. If it's limited money that David says that won't cripple the state, I'm really not sure why it will be as accessible as they say. At the end of these responses, I've rebutted the fundamental assumptions of their case and therefore no impact can be credited from government bench. Why is Irene's extension then debate winning? The principle of when the state compensates you. And again, I want you to listen to why this is the most important principle in the debate. The conclusion of upholding that a particular political party winning is equivalent to a moral failure of the state is giving power to the state to define who should win and what kind of ideology should rule that country. This is bad because it solidifies dynasties and monopolies that harms future generations as well. This is worse than the divide because you lose the mechanisms of discourse, which is a prerequisite for any benefit on government bench. Secondly, we engage in the best case of gov bench, which OO was too afraid to defend. If it's mostly politically aligned people within the country, which Toby doesn't bounce back from after Irene responds to this, this is bad. The group of people will assess the success of their current government by the metric of their own current government. Obviously, groupthink will say it's good even if it's not. David concedes that this is the context that they want the state to run in. This is where you get monopolies in ideology, where people do not actively question that monopoly of the state, which Gov Bench says is already bad in principle. In the worst case of opposition, OO just says it's good for opposition people to stay, but they assume that the opposition who will stay will actively question the elected government. Reasons? I don't know. Assuming that these few elite people lose hope or won't actively question the government, it's still good from CO because it is the perception from the grassroots that at least they still have hope, at least they still have a kakampi that makes sure they still have hope in the future. OG, if you have one.
While I admire your optimism, there's no certainty nor urgency in your attempt to co-opt the benefit of better government. You force people to live in a state that they fundamentally disagree with until the next election for a chance at creating change that the actors themselves can determine to be a stretch.
Yeah. So even if they're not actively creating change, it is the perception from the grassroots that at least they are staying, they are forced to stay, that gives them hope in the future. Assuming that migration and people leaving is an active threat to political parties, the way politicians will react is worse for the political climate for the most vulnerable. And this assumes, right, that the polarization is less, that centrist policies will pass from closing government. If politicians are so scared to create political divides because it will make people leave, they will go into further centrist against policies. This may sound good, but we implore you to imagine what it looks like for the most vulnerable. They have lived realities that need to be strongly heard. They need strong candidates to champion a radical change because radical needs begs for a radical policy. I agree that this has the potential to create divide within the election process, but the harms from Gov's policy outlast the election because if people feel like they can no longer be represented by any politician in the ground, where will they go? They turn to violence, other means of forwarding their interests. This is the mechanism where you get all of the impacts from OO that CO only proves. At the end of this debate, we agree that our election system is imperfect, but the alternatives that a government bench grants to these people makes it so worse that even the most vulnerable people who everyone wanted to protect in the debate will be screwed over. Very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you so much, Opposition Whip, for that speech, and thank you everyone for this wonderful national grand final for this year. Do note that the awarding will be at 8 p.m. tonight. The Zoom call details will be sent via Discord at 7:45 p.m. As for the panelists, please head to Discord room 1. We will be deliberating there instead of here at the Zoom. So thank you everyone and have a good one.
Thanks for the round, everyone. Good luck.
Thanks all for the round.
Thanks for the round.
GG.
Thank you, everyone.